Hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Silvertown. You may realise that I'm not Matthew Beaumont, I'm Armin, and he had a bit of an emergency, which is why I'm kind of stepping in, but everyone else is here. So I guess just to give a bit of introduction into the format, we're going to do all good? We're going to do about a 5-minute intro from each of the speakers, basically introduce themselves and saying their pitch for this notion of London being in limbo. And then we use that to go into discussion and then a Q&A at the end. If anyone has questions that they want to ask, feel free just to put their hand up and we'll do it as while the conversation goes. So, Phineas, if you'd like to begin.
Yeah. Hello, my name's Finn. I am an architecture writer and it's great to kind of be here, I guess. I live on a narrowboat, and the reason I do this is partly because it's cool and it sort of spices up my Tinder profile. But the other reason is because I can't afford to live in London. I've been priced out, which is slightly strange because I'm a pretty middle-class person with a decent job that pays a salary and blah, blah, blah. And yet still, it's just so expensive that I've had to resort to sort of sleeping on a bed which is built on top of a septic tank in a slowly sinking piece of metal, just to live a sort of vaguely urban lifestyle. And I've done it for 4 years, and that feels like a long time to me, but I'm sure that a lot of the people who've lived all their lives on boats or who've lived next to the canal see me as one of a kind of sweep of young, trendy, annoying, gentrifying artist yuppie twats who are kind of clogging up the canals with our stinky boats, cycling around, drinking coffee and all that stuff. So when this kind of question of London in limbo came up, I guess inevitably it's hooked on gentrification. And although there's loads of stuff that I think we're going to talk about today, I'm quite interested in exploring the discourse around gentrification, because I'm not entirely convinced, but I feel like the way it normally pans out is pretty insubstantial. So I'm wondering whether gentrification, at best, is a distraction. The narrative around gentrification is a distraction from more pragmatic concerns about house building, and at worst is a kind of regional nationalism where we see these kind of people who are from a particular place is intrinsically superior to strangers or immigrants coming from outside, even if that outside just is another city or another postcode. I'm not totally convinced by this, but I'm kind of intrigued by it, because I get it. It's very tempting to blame our kind of Vice-reading, iPhone X-carrying people who have these sort of fake celiac diets because they once ate a loaf of bread and it made them feel a bit full, and now they think they're allergic to gluten. I know why those people are annoying, and I kind of want the housing crisis to be their fault. But it probably isn't. And I think that the more we try and blame them for it, the further we get from actually talking about root causes. So I just want to, there's lots of things I want to show, but I want to show one graph to kind of kick this off. So maybe you could get my presentation up. Here it comes. London in limbo.
Technical is not our strong point at the moment, but
Oh, okay. Yeah, so like flip to slide 50 or something. Flip to slide 19. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Go, keep going, keep going. Yeah, stop, back. Keep it, yeah, there you go, okay. What kind of strange thing is this? Can I borrow your microphone?
absolutely.
So you might have seen this graph before, but I think I'm going to show it to you again because it's very, very important. It shows house building over the 20th century by sector. So blue is council housing, pink is private developer housing, and yellow is housing associations, people like Peabody and the Guinness Trust. What you see is that at the end of the war, World War II, there's a huge boom in council house building, and first Labour, and then the Tories, and then Labour, and then the Tories pledged to build more and more and more council houses. And responding to that, the private sector goes, oh, God, okay, we've got to build houses to make money, get it. And so they start building loads of houses. And that kind of ticks along and slowly declines until you hit the 80s, when essentially Thatcher pulls the plug on council house building entirely, and it very quickly turns to no council houses being built at all. This red line is the price of housing. So you can fairly clearly see, as soon as we stop building council housing, the price of all housing goes through the roof. And it kind of drops a little bit here, which is the 90s crash. It drops a little bit here, which is the 2008 crash. But more or less, the less we build, the more expensive everything gets. What's really fascinating, though, is that the private sector doesn't change. So I guess the Tory plan was, we'll stop building, and all the private sector will go, oh great, like now we can build like twice as much, and we can cash in on all that additional demand that the public isn't picking up. But instead, the private sector does roughly the same amount as it's always done. And I think this is kind of pretty clear evidence that there's a kind of natural capacity to how much housing the private sector will build. And we know that they have permission to build 600,000, planning permission to build 600,000 homes, and yet every year we only build about 100,000. So there's this sort of extraordinary lie, which is that the private sector might be able to meet the housing demand. It just can't, it never has, and we need the public sector back. So I'll stop there, because that's probably longer than 5 minutes, but I just wanted to sort of put that graph out there, because I think it adds some proper, like, numerical context for a discussion, rather than just sort of kind of lazily blaming people like the serial killers bar for changing neighbourhoods, when it's really a much more kind of public problem than that.
Thank you very much.
And can we get my thing on my PowerPoint?
So should we check the mic?
So we start with the first one, make it very big. It's bigger than close. This one? The first one, yeah. So my name is Rut Blees de Luxemburg. I'm an artist, I'm a photographer. Is it working? Can you hear me? Is it working? So of course the question of London in limbo is also a question of the image. The question how a city like London is represented, and how this representation of the city feeds into the desire for the city. So I'm starting with a work I did in '95. This is a long time ago. It's a social housing estate in the East End, and instead of showing the interior or showing the view from this place, I decided to look downwards, to sort of go with the vertiginous speed and the pleasure of letting go. Now, this is on City Road, and those of you who know City Road, who know that part of Old Street, will have noticed how that part of London has changed, how London has been transformed. And I would argue that the question of the image and photography is central to the transformation. So let's move to the second image. So I made a series of work called London Dust, in which I really focused on the representation of the city and how developers, architects, and city planners are using the image to project an idea of the future city we can all sort of go with that projection, fall for it. And next image. So this is a very good example of this. What you see here is what the developers who were behind the Pinnacle made. This is a CGI image. So what is called the walkie-talkie is the image on the right, was not finished when they did this CGI, and the Pinnacle wasn't finished either. Now the Pinnacle never got built. They only got to the 7th floor, they ran out of money. The walkie-talkie is a reality. Now this image, this CGI, is 5 years old, and when I saw it, I sort of, in the city of London, where it was pasted, I mean, I was drawn. This image is so alluring. There's such a beauty in these CGIs, where the sky and the buildings become a perfect fantasy to be manipulated by. But, of course, that's what it is. It is a fantasy. And I think the Pinnacle makes that very clear, because it never got realized. But if you're not very adept at reading images, you wouldn't know that. You know, the CGI is just as believable as my photograph. So, next image. So what I'm trying to do is interrupt the fantasy, interrupt the manipulation. And the tool I'm using is the one which is basically the enemy of photography, which is dust. Dust speaks of time, it speaks of lived experience, it speaks of decay. I mean, this is a very dusty building. Very interesting, you know, to think about that. So I placed in front of the perfect CGI these sandbags. And the sandbag for me is really the symptom of our contemporary London. You see them everywhere, they have no value, but they are these sort of stubborn little objects, and they are very useful for whatever purposes, but at the same time they are kind of absurd. So I placed a sandbag in front of the CGI and thereby bring in the question of the material reality. Next one. Okay, there you see another one. And next one. Similar here, the CGI behind, and then I have the sort of stain. Stain is another interesting concept in my work, that which shouldn't be there, that which somehow, this liquid which pours out, makes its own trajectories, and you don't quite know where does this stain come from. So it introduces also the body. Another important thing for us to think about, the body within the city. Next one. Okay, this is a very early work. Next one. Next one. We don't have time to show the film. I made a film about it. And I want to show you a public artwork I made recently in Victoria. Victoria, close to Westminster, another highly developed part of London. And on Westminster City Hall, I made a public artwork. This is the site for it. Next one. Next one. And my inspiration came from a painting by Pablo, The Hunt in the Forest, where you can go deep into the forest. The perspective allows some kind of immersion. Next one. Next one. Next one. So here's the work being installed. It was made on concrete panels. So I make a photographic work which is cast in concrete. And the idea is to show a forest, but this is not a natural forest. This is an urban forest, which I found in Beijing and in London, birch trees, which are pioneer trees. And I wanted to bring in the notion, the image of the forest, which I think is something we should also think about when we talk about the city, the relationship we have with nature. I think this is sort of pulsing away more and more at the moment. Next one. Yes, there you see the installation. Next one. Westminster City Hall. Next one. Yeah, so it's a large 30-meter panel, concrete, meant to be there for a long time. Next one. Next one. Next one. Yes, and I managed to sort of bring into it, under the radar, again, the sack. Now, the sack is an interesting object, as I said earlier, because it has many meanings. It's ambiguous. Is it a gift? Does someone bring a gift? Or is it sort of when you have a crisis and you need sand sacks, is it an emergency? Or is it something that speaks about the swag, getting away with it, the robber? It's accumulation, it's too much, it's bursting at the seams. And I think what we have seen in London over the last years is this getting away with it, an accumulation, and something that's not really being, it's very difficult to understand and difficult to interrogate because it's all hidden, but just like the said, it's also quite public. And I think on that note, I stop. Oh no, the next picture. Thanks.
Is this on? I'm quite loud anyway. Hello, my name's Saskia. I'm from a housing campaign down the road in Stratford. My housing campaign's called Focus E15 housing campaign. We've been going for about 4 years now. We started because a local hostel, a local young person's hostel, the mother and baby unit in this hostel was being closed down. The reason it was being closed down is because there was a £40,000 funding cut. And that's how this campaign was born, because we stood and we fought the council to not lose this funding cut. But over that we fought the council because what these young women were told with their young children was there's no room for you in London, there's no room for you in Newham, so we're giving you the option to either move to Manchester, Birmingham, Hastings, and if you don't take that option, you've made yourself intentionally homeless, which means we wash our hands of you and we don't have to help you. That's how this campaign started. We, very early on in the campaign, we started occupying places. We occupied the local housing office, we occupied the council, and through really doing that, we met a lot of people who are going through housing disasters. And what we really learned is that it's massively widespread in London, social cleansing. And when I say social cleansing, I mean working class people being forcibly removed from the city, usually under the guise of what I just spelled out, intentional homelessness if they don't take property in Manchester, Birmingham, Hastings. I'm not going to speak for that long, but I was speaking to my other campaigners because that was exciting. I was speaking to other campaigners before I came here to say, here, I'm speaking at this thing, what do you think I should say? If we're talking about London and Limbo. And one of our top campaigners is a woman called Janice. Janice comes from Canning Town, and her dad worked here. Her dad worked on the docks from 14 years old to 65, and he just passed away last year. And I said, Janice, what do you think I should say about London and Limbo? And she said, well, we have to ask the question, like, London isn't in limbo for everybody, it's in limbo for certain people. And we need to talk about who those people are and who London isn't in limbo for. I mean, these windows are fantastic, aren't they? You can see it all here, like a picture paints 1,000 words, right? It's not in limbo for everybody, so yeah, I'd be interested in the discussion about talking about that. And I agree with Finn about really looking at the problem and not just kind of talking about the symptoms of the problem. And so I haven't got a slide or anything, but I've got a little statistic to help illustrate things maybe. So we're 10 years after the global crash, the financial crisis. This year, just to paint the picture a little bit, the top 1% in terms of like income, and people that take home an annual income of over 275,000. Their living standards and their income this year is raised from 7% to 8.5% higher than in the past. That means that statistically they have completely recovered from the financial crash. Now, in comparison, this is just one statistic in comparison, and may help our conversation. In contrast, the income of 22 to 30-year-olds in London now and across the country has gone down by 7% since 2007 and 2008. So that might help the conversation and talk about why, like Finn said, actually it's not just working class people that are struggling and finding it hard now, but it's a lot of people and a lot of young people. So I'm just going to stop there, and then I hope everyone's going to chat all. That's it.
Thank you everyone for that. I guess we'll go straight into housing, because obviously that's one of the most pressing issues. And Phineas, you said that private housing never really meets the needs of the country. And there seems to be a growing understanding that simply building more homes isn't the answer. Would you agree with that?
What is the sound? Should we like give up on mics? What's
No, wait, yeah,
No, continue. Sorry.
shouldn't work in it.
okay?
It's just...
Can you explain more what you mean by there's a growing consensus that we don't need more homes?
So there's lots of questions being saying about actually building more homes is the answer, whether we can actually adopt different methods to solve the crisis, which isn't just building. You know, a lot of developers are now land banking, which obviously raises the value. There's lots of homes staying vacant. So whilst, you know, people say we need to build more homes, that isn't necessarily, you know, the solution.
Yeah, okay, so if I can grab your mic. Yeah, I guess David Orr from the housing, the National House Building Federation, some network of housing associations, so often just his line is like, we need more bloody houses. And it's a really good line because you can kind of talk to anybody with that line, because it obviously works for working class people who are being maybe evicted from council housing. They can see the argument. It works for middle class people who are aspiring to own a home and can't. And it also works for the incredibly wealthy who want to treat housing as a kind of commodity. So I do agree in the sense that it's that line of we need more bloody housing doesn't like get it doesn't really address like systemic inequality, and it is easy within that kind of narrative for a kind of continuation of the same old stuff. We are building houses. We're building loads of houses. But here's some fun stats for you. Last year in Knightsbridge, 59% of the homes that were sold were bought by companies based in tax havens, which doesn't suggest that those houses are going to people who live in them, even to rich people who live in them. It sort of suggests that these things are purely commodity vehicles. If you want to talk about new builds, so I guess that stuff, 62% of that stuff is being bought by investors. Now, some of those investors rent them out to people, but some of them don't. They just sort of sit there. So I totally agree that just building houses isn't kind of clever enough, and that we need to kind of see house building as within a kind of more political context. I don't think it's complicated. I can totally understand why David takes that argument, because it is a very good way of persuading a Tory council that they should build more houses, because they're like, look, it's good for middle class people like you. It's great. But yeah, ultimately we need to get more sophisticated.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. What our campaign talks about all the time is opening empty homes. That's one of the key things that we talk about, not because we think, oh, actually, people shouldn't build homes, but actually it's absolutely fucking criminal. It's criminal to walk past people that are on the street in overcrowded housing and slum housing. I've stood in a room with a mum and a dad and 4 kids in the one room, and that's not uncommon anymore. We're talking about slum housing now, and that's the context that we look at massive empty homes like we're seeing here, homes that actually it's better for rich people to buy a home rather than put their money in a bank and get interest, because interest rates on having an empty house that they don't have to rent out, they get more money back. So we do talk about empty homes and having them opened up. Grenfell, obviously the kind of chat immediately after Grenfell, and you've probably seen it, Jeremy Corbyn saying, well, actually, we should open these homes for people that have suffered this disaster. I don't know if people have been following it, but it's still a disaster. The people that suffered in Grenfell, not only in the tower, but the surrounding areas, are still in total limbo, and they could open homes and put people in them now. So it's kind of, yeah.
And many of them are still without a home.
Yeah, totally.
3-4 months later.
Yeah, it's incredible.
How much of it do you think is down to this kind of British myth that, you know, we need to own our homes? Because this is not something which is, you know, replicated just in, you know, focusing on Europe. It's not replicated just in Europe. You know, we're sort of one of the 4th lowest home owning country, but there's a sense of, you know, everyone needs to own a home.
Can we bring up one of my clips? Is the audio working on this? I love this bit.
I'm excited. Sorry, 1 second.
Okay, we can maybe say something else in the meantime. I thought that, sorry.
So, for example, in Germany, it's quite sort of talked about having a very favourable rental system, and that's not replicated in London. Is that something you've experienced the benefits of in Germany?
Well, I've been living here for quite a while, so I'm not that familiar with the German scenario anymore, but maybe one can bring it back to art, because we're also in an exhibition here, and I was told earlier that this building is now being open to artists for very cheap rent by the GLA. And it's incredible, because this building is actually between a ruin and between something else emerging. So it's also about places where people can make. It's not just about living, but also about making. And I think it's quite radical that they're using a building like this, which is so sort of precarious in itself. So that points towards a real shift from the GLA, that they're allowing this now to become an artist space. So obviously some strong lobbying has taken place somewhere. So I think empowerment is actually possible.
So just to give some context into this building, this was the old distribution factory for Carlsberg, the beer, which I think ceased being used as that about 20 years ago. And now it's being taken over by a social enterprise called the Milko Project, who extensively basically renovate buildings such as these and turn them into artists' workshops, studios. And they work very closely with the GLA, and that's what they're doing to this. So there's actually development going on right now. I'm very happy the builders have stopped building for about 2 hours. So that's what's going to happen, and in about, by the end of the year, this will be used by artists, designers, set designers, fashion designers, all, like Rut said, to make stuff. That's the context.
Let's explore this myth, and I'm kind of interested in what you think about it as well. Can you, I imagine I'm doing that. That one. No, not that one. The next one, Thatcher. No, they don't. Oh, they don't. That one. Can you get that on play?
How do you get this to play?
Play it on my laptop.
Yeah, plug it to yours. Yeah.
So can you give me the audio? The mini jack.
So can everyone put their hand up if they own their own home, just out of curiosity? Up. Okay.
There's a few.
Everyone who thinks they will own a home in their life.
A nation of hope.
You can sort of see it here.
A nation of homeowners will be self-reliant, independent, and able to do what they want with their own lives in their own homes.
So this is the moment when Thatcher launches the pledge to have a 30% discount on buying your own home. If you're buying it off if you're a council tenant, you're buying it off the council. She will give you 30% of the value to help you buy it, and it's a sort of vote grab, and it works, and there's a landslide, and the Tories get in 1980. Interestingly, Labour introduced the right to buy policy because they thought it was nice that people who wanted to buy their own home could, but not many people took it up. It was sort of like, well, why? I already have a home, which I'm not going to get evicted from, which has low rent, which is maintained by the council. This feels like a pretty good deal to me. And in 1979, when that film was made, 43% of the population rented from the council. Now that's just like council tenants. There's also other people renting privately. So I find that stat astonishing, because now it's like much smaller. And we're told that the British have this kind of innate desire to own homes. It's like, it's all we really care about. It's like that and football. It sums up like British identity, which is phenomenally dull, like, cultural thing, but it's sort of not true, or it just doesn't seem to be true. It seems to have been invented fairly recently to kind of constantly justify why we don't build council housing in the volumes that we used to. And I'm really interested in like where it's come from, whether there's any truth in it, whether it's a complete narrative that's just been kind of imposed on us and we've started to believe it, or whether there is something weird about Britishness and we sort of desire to own a small chunk of land as a kind of hangover from the Enclosures Act or something. I'm not quite sure, but it seems to me to be a kind of con that's been, there's been a big PR campaign to trick us into believing that this is what we really want, when, you know, if you were sort of asking a child what they wanted to be when they grew up, or like what they thought that their life, a good life might be like, they might say like astronaut or ballerina or sort of nuclear physicist or something, I don't know, but they probably wouldn't say, well, I really want to own like a small bit of land with like a little fence around it, and like that's the thing that I'm striving for.
But I think you're simplifying it a bit, because there's also this whole home ownership is part of a larger narrative about financialization. Yeah. So if you want to have some sort of financial leverage, you need to own a place, basically.
Sure, but as you saw in the graph I showed, it's only recently that homes became valuable.
Yeah, but this is now. This is a while ago. I mean, this is where the situation we find ourselves now, and it's. I'm not trying to suggest it's not highly complex and terrible, but trying, you know, we are finding ourselves in the situation now, and what can be the proposals we can come up with to challenge that?
So I just wanted to throw something into that. I think the policy of own your own home was sold to us. It was sold to us as an attractive thing, no doubt. There's a really good film called Si Se Puede, which is about a housing movement in Spain and Catalonia. And it's really good because also in Spain they were sold the idea of, oh, you should own your own home, etc., etc. And so this housing movement has came out of people having mortgages, the financial crash, not being able to pay back that mortgage, and then having the bank take the homes off them, and having lots of empty homes in Spain and in Catalonia. And the reason I bring it up is that you have to also look at the context of why this idea was sold to us, being tied into a mortgage. We have to talk about the word capitalism. We're living in a capitalist system right now, and we have to understand the economics around that, because if we don't, then we're not having a look at the whole picture. And what does it mean to tie people down to a mortgage, because not many people can cash buy a house? And how does this benefit the government for people to be doing this as opposed to being free and renting? I think it's worth thinking about that as well.
I think definitely, but I guess there's systems in place which exist within capitalism, which is better than the British system. So, you know, what can we do as a society and as a government to ensure that you know, we don't need to own our own home, and if there's like a rental system in place which is more favourable, that we can you know, take into this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's tricky. You know, it's really tricky because our campaign's experience of fighting on the street for housing for people is that the only time we win anything is when we shout loud enough and we shame the council, as opposed to the council saying, oh my god, I didn't realise this was happening, I'll sort it out right now. So it's a funny thing, and especially it's a funny thing in this city where you've got the city of London, the financial city of London, as a kind of heart. I mean, it's a difference of opinion. I'd be interested to know what everyone thought. How do we win housing? How do we win better renting? Like my campaign and what we do, we believe that we fight on the street, we empower people to speak, and we create a movement on the street. Maybe people have other ideas about what they do, but I suppose that's the bigger question though, isn't it? How do we win that?
Yeah, I mean, like, a lot's been said about demand for housing in London. I used to work for DCLG, unfortunately, as a statistician. And I think like the biggest thing is like, so a lot's been said about supply by you guys, but not so much has been said about demand. And like, is there a problem that everyone's very London-centric? Like everyone, like all young people at the moment aspire to live in London, and like it's not made attractive enough for people to look at other cities in the UK. Like, does anyone have anything to say about that?
Yeah,
about maybe
but let's
London being too
bring up another
attractive?
slide.
Get this slide up, go on.
Everyone likes looking at stuff, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Right, scroll. This is such a... Stop. These pie charts. Okay, so just on this point about the London-centricness of the UK, this is a pie chart showing the population of the United States of America and the proportion of that population that lives in New York City. So New York City, huge, 8.5 million people, one of the great cities, blah, blah, blah. Now, next slide, if we scroll down. This is the population of America, same thing. There's New York again. And those are all the next 20 or 23 biggest cities in America next to it. So you can sort of see, crudely, this is like a graph of like the combined population of massive cities in America versus the overall population of America. Next slide. 35 largest city. Okay. This is the UK. So London takes up the same proportion of our population as the 35 largest cities of America put together take up of the American population. The overall. So this is like astonishingly weird. 1 in 7 people live in London. And it's a completely bizarre stat, especially when you think that over half of the British population live in the countryside. So this like remaining chunk of people who live in cities that aren't London in the UK is like weirdly small. If you scroll to the next one. So we actually have a kind of more, this I've been told is not quite accurate, so ignore that one, but we have a more capital heavy nation than Tokyo, than Japan does, which is baffling because it's such a low density city. I'm going to have to go back to my laptop for this next stat, but stat. There are 152,000 hectares in Greater London. Now, if you spread all of the 10 million people out evenly within those hectares, you'd have one person every 14 square meters. So that's, I mean, it's a slightly weird thing to say, but like that should give you a sense of how low density London is. 24% of our land is taken up by back gardens. Like, I mean, I like back gardens, but that seems a little much to me. 38% of our land is public open space. 22% of our land is green belt. Only 9% is going on housing. And yet we have 1 in 7 British people living in this city. So that kind of clash of the capital heaviness and the low densityness is like a very strange phenomenon. And it's sort of why it's so easy for developers to extract value, because all development land becomes just ludicrously valuable because there's this kind of artificial constraint on its availability. I'm not someone who thinks you should go and build on the greenbelt, because I think all of this stuff is solvable within the kind of political context that we already have. Councils, roughly, a London borough will own between 20 and 40% of the land in that borough. So there's a huge amount of land still in public ownership. And if we were much more creative and kind of address these like macro problems properly, then we could solve this. It's not rocket science. The Germans seem to manage.
And this point about councils is interesting, and Saskia, you brought up as well, because it seems to me that in recent issues of controversy, to say it lightly, councils seem to attract a lot of criticism. Haygate Estate, obviously your experience with Carpenters, Aylesbury's another one. They seem to be, along with developers, vilified as kind of perpetrators of all evil. Is that criticism fair from your experiences?
Yeah, I've got something in my bag. It's not a stat, actually is a stats. It's like a show and tell, isn't it? It's so funny. This isn't that attractive, by the way, so don't judge us. If you want to come and help artistically our campaign, we clearly do that. But basically, this is like a spoof of the Newham mag, which gets handed out in Newham. And we made a spoof of it to talk about what the council are up to in Newham. Now, Newham Council are a complete Labour stronghold through and through for a very, very long time. And this guy here, who's also Scottish, which is really embarrassing for me because he's a proper dodgy guy. He's really dodgy. It's called Robin Wales. And the reason I bring this up, I've got loads of them so you can all take one away with you, but a startling statistic about Newham Council is that they have borrowed a lot of money, a lot of money, of all different sources, including BAE Systems. BAE Systems makes weapons, by the way. But they have borrowed so much money that now, if you live in Newham and you pay council tax, £1 out of every bit of tax that is paid, 80 pence on that goes back to loan repayments. And it's not just the loan repayments, it's the interest on the loan repayments to these different entities. So it's like this chaotic system that they've run down. Basically, when you start to examine what the council does, you see that it's in chaos, and it's not just that as well. When you start a fight for housing or you see something wrong in your local borough, what do? You go and see your local MP. You go to the council and say, here, this is going on, can you help us, can you do something? That's the first point. And what we have found in our campaigning is that we go to our local council, we go to Robin Wales, and not only do they not help us, they actively don't help us. 1 year ago, they came down to our street stall where we have Newham nags and we have leaflets, and the police came down in a van and they took our table away. They took our table away. I wish I had a slide to show you. And we said, free the Focus E15 table and all political prisoners. But that's incredible, right? It's dangerous to have leaflets. But it was orchestrated by the council, and this all came out. And the council also orchestrated to help arrest one of our campaigners called Jasmine Stone. I will send out links to our website, etc. This is all detailed, photographed, everything. But what we have found practically is that the council have been doing everything they can to shut us down, as opposed to saying, we want to hear your voice and we want to do something about it. So that's been our experience. That's why maybe for us, we see the council in that light.
Thanks, I think a lot of people do. And this point about borrowing is interesting because how much is it the fault of central government? Because at the end of the day, they've put out massive cuts to the council, and this is why they can't pay their dues essentially. So how much of the fault lies actually with central government rather than the councils?
That's an argument. People say, well, actually, the councils, the local councils, Robin Wales will say, actually, my hands are tied. But we have to remember that in the past, there was Labour councils that said, we are not implementing these cuts. And they were put in prison for it. They said, we are not doing it, we refuse, we're on strike. And actually, some people might say, well, that's one step too far for people. But when I see people that are putting themselves on the line, their children on the line, occupying houses, being chucked around by bailiffs, actually, if you voted someone to represent you, I think it's the time that they should put themselves on the line and they should say, we are not going to implement these cuts. And if they do that, people might trust them. If they don't do that, then they're seen to be hand in hand with the government, I think. But yeah.
I'm quite keen to, I guess, take the conversation away from housing. I know it's a very important issue. We spent a good time on it, and talk about the other buzzword at the moment, which is gentrification. So, Phineas, obviously, your intro speech focused on this quite a lot. So, what are the kind of the main sort of, I guess, not symptoms, the main cause of this at the moment? Is it something which is in the top down? Is it bottom up? Talk us through your thoughts on it.
Have you got a slide?
You know what? Yeah, lots of slides. I am sort of a bit confused by the gentrification. I feel like there are two kinds. There's the kind where Southwark says we're going to demolish the Haygate estate, evicts everybody, and then rebuilds it as much more expensive housing. And I think the first tranche of those houses has entirely been sold to overseas investors. So there's like that kind, which is, it seems very black and white, that this is like a total failure of civic and public responsibility, backed up by a shitload of money. But then there's another kind of gentrification, which is a kind of slower process of things changing over time, which, because we don't have rent control or any real form of renters' rights, means that people get kind of inevitably priced out of an area rather than strategically priced out of an area. And I feel like that second kind is much more complex, because although you can say like it is bad that this area has changed so much that people who are born here now can't afford to live here. You can also, I think it's really important actually, especially in the kind of context of rising xenophobia and sort of nervousness around Brexit, that we don't ever fall into the trap of saying people from other places are bad and they have no right to come and live here. And I think there is an edge where that sort of desire to protect an area's kind of culture, or at least the people who live there, from being kind of priced out, tips over into a form of xenophobia. And I don't know exactly how you kind of chart your way through that minefield, but I do think that the solution is probably not to blame the people coming in. It's to blame the fact that there's no rent control, the fact that there's no kind of political oversight, there's no creativity in the kind of house building sector. I sort of was trying to think of a good metaphor for this on the DLR, and I thought maybe it's like there used to be no law saying you had to wear seatbelts, right? You could drive a car without wearing a seatbelt, and lots of people died in car crashes as a result. And you could say, this is really bad, driving is killing people, we should discourage people from driving. Or you could say, no, we should exercise political control, make a law that requires people to wear a seatbelt and try and get those deaths down. And they did the second one, so instead of blaming the driving, they blamed the seatbelts. And I feel like for the second kind of gentrification, we have to try something similar. There needs to be a sort of acknowledgement that this is not inevitable, that there are mechanisms that work in Germany and Amsterdam, even in New York, that can protect the affordability of an area without tipping into this kind of protectionism, which is more problematic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Definitely. And I'm quite conscious of the fact that we are in a building which is hosting an art exhibition in an area which is about to be covered about £4 billion of taxpayer and private money. And for many, artists and art are seen as the kind of shock troopers of gentrification. You know, they come in and prices go up, and the cycle begins. Is that something that I guess you're saying isn't the case?
No, like it's so super well documented. Artists come in and then they change the culture, and then developers can exploit that, and people get evicted as a sort of byproduct. I'm saying that the thing we should focus on is the developers exploiting that, rather than the shock troops bit, which I think is naive. It's blaming the wrong person.
And Rut, as an artist, have you experienced this tension in London? Is it something that you've kind of explored in your work? Is it something you've experienced firsthand?
So when I first moved to Shoreditch in the 90s, it was a bit like this kind of scenario, and we all know what it's like now. So yes, I've been part of that wave of gentrification. But I also think, you know, as creative people, we can all perhaps exercise our creativity and find other ways to make things work for ourselves, but also for the wider community. So it's ridiculous to sort of demonize the artists. Not all of them have become super successful. A lot of them have to leave themselves, you know. So, but I want to bring in nature. I noticed you put some plants out here.
Yes, we're a big kind of...
Whose idea was that? I mean, it's very, it's quite modest. It's quite modest, but I think...
This is our attempt at nature.
Yeah, we need some vegetation in here. It's a bit too complicated.
I think that's also one of the paradigm shifts we are seeing in London at the moment, where people are becoming very aware of the pollution, are becoming very aware of how the city has to change to become really livable, and how these kinds of developments are also toxic in many ways, not just because of expulsion of people, but also of a certain complete destructive quality of the environment. So I think we are looking at the discussion is actually much bigger. So the expulsion is perhaps a good term here, not just of people, but also of quality of life, and how we can address the bigger picture as creatives, as artists.
Saskia, would you agree with that? Is the kind of influx of artists something which you've seen happen in Newham?
You know what, I would completely agree with what's already been said. I think it's, I don't want to say a waste of time, but it is essentially that argument sometimes that people take about artists is, it's a bit dull actually, isn't it? Because it's not the problem, it's just not the problem, it's full stop. And actually, what you were saying as well actually about the environment, yeah, you look at the bigger picture, that is the bigger picture is the environment. And it is true what you're saying about the big smoke, basically, yeah.
So I think we have to make other alliances. I think that's where artists are being challenged, to find other kind of communication channels and make other alliances.
Please tell us about these alliances. I'm
trying to work it out. You know, it's a fluid scenario. It's all emerging, and we are merging with it. So we're trying to figure it out.
With these alliances, it has to be community-based, right? It has to be
but community
localized
networks. It's not just a community on the ground, it's also a community up there. You know, we also have to speak to the GLA or to the people in power.
Well, I was interested about this role because for me, prior to knowing about this building, the GLA, I didn't think were too kind of conducive to supporting the arts. And now seeing this building and seeing it supporting the Milco project and other ventures, it seems they are to an extent. But it seems to be, these are kind of the exceptions now. It doesn't really seem to be a mainstream institutional support for the arts as it was.
I think there's a shift. There's something changing. You know, the tectonic plates are changing all around us. And I sense that also in London at the moment, where people actually view with the organization, you know, where the people feeling more and more empowered, feeling more daring, the students becoming more vocal about the sort of fees and the burden. So things are slowly shifting. So do you feel that, or am I being too optimistic?
Optimism is always good.
I guess I'm fairly optimistic about this administration. I feel like all the civil servants kept their good ideas on the back burner until Boris had gone, and now they're sort of getting them out.
Sorry, this is in reference to Sadiq Khan.
Yeah. I think there's this sort of, well, I certainly knew civil servants who are like, we're not going to tell Boris about this because we think he's going to lose, and we're going to try and get Sadiq to do it instead. So there's like, I don't know, there's the London Borough Capital Culture Initiative, so that things like that are sort of slowly creeping in, but it is still, you can't get away from like the bigger problem, which is like boroughs sometimes, like Newham with Mr. Wales, fucking dodgy people.
Yeah.
And Jeremy Corbyn can talk about, and it's brilliant that he is talking about like taking on the boroughs and stopping some of these mad schemes that they've got. But we really all need to take local politics much more seriously, I think. Like we should be voting more at a local level than at a national level, because that's where a lot of the shady deals get done. And you should all read the Private Eye, because they seem to be the only journalists who kind of actually look into what's going on at a local level. And these institutions are kind of huge, very, very powerful, with hundreds, thousands of staff. And often they're run by crooks. But we have some power over those things, right? Even people who can't vote in general elections can vote in local elections. So, if you, it's an easy thing to say, but like, vote in local elections. Take them very seriously. Like, know who your candidates are and what their things are, because it does trickle through.
I'm keen to open up the floor now, so does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask? Yep, someone here. Thanks.
Hi, I was wondering, I had a question for you. Obviously, you went through the regeneration project that Shoreditch became, and we all know, as you said, what Shoreditch is now. Do you think that there's any particular lessons that can be learned from Shoreditch in areas like here or other regenerating areas?
The lessons learned. What are the lessons? Yes, I mean, one lesson which is very important is you need your community. You need to find your own community. And what happened in Shoreditch, of course, very soon, Y-Cube, etc., came in and sort of hoovered up all what was there to hoover up. It shifted very, very quickly. So only those who had got a place early were the ones who were safe, ultimately. So actually if you can, buy a place here. Or buy the studio. Yeah, so because they were the ones who actually were safe. It sounds terrible, yeah. But so community building and have your pull your resources together, do things as a crew.
That's I guess quite a kind of bottom-up way of looking at things in terms of, we need action on the ground. But is there something which the government could have done or the local authorities could have done which kind of helped the situation?
I'm sure that I don't know what they did. It was not very clear, and it wasn't actually my interest as an artist. And these debates that we're having now, no one had them then. It was completely absent from our mind to even. Certainly from my mind, so it didn't really happen. And the first picture showed of the social housing. When I made this work, social housing was seen as so, sort of was very stigmatized. So making these images was actually to try to think about that kind of modernism, also in an aesthetic way, because there's a beauty to these hubs of housing where so many people live together. So I tried to have a different kind of response to that. So.
Any more questions? Yeah, I think we have one, two right there. Got a mic here. You've got a mic there. Put your hands up for questions. That one there. One there. Okay, cool. Nice. Cool.
What did you think at the Conservative Party conference of the fact that Theresa May suddenly said that she was going to start building more houses? Because that was quite surprising to me, to say the least.
Let's have another clip. Maybe I can set this up while you... Do you want to answer while I do this?
I would say that what that demonstrates is that the issue of the housing crisis is very much mainstream now, and that's why she was forced to have to address it. Either that, or she's secretly left-wing because she's got a Frida Kahlo bracelet on, I don't know. Might be the second, I've no idea. What did you think of it?
Obviously, I think that would be a good thing, but I was pretty surprised, and I don't really believe necessarily. I sort of think she must have some kind of ulterior motive, or there's going to be some kind of caveat in it.
Do the 5,000 houses a year. More smoke and mirrors.
That's interesting. I didn't really get from the headlines the actual numbers behind it. Really.
No, you don't. You have to keep you have to always check out the numbers.
So there we go. That's why I was looking for ideas.
I got it from the news, by the way.
This clip is from 1967. It's Sir Keith Joseph, who's the Conservative Housing Minister at the Tory Party conference, also talking about the Conservative...
The only answer is more houses. The government are looking to increasing the productivity 400 a year.
400,000 houses. So that was the pledge in 1967, and that was how many the Conservative government built 2 years ago in 2015. So why have I showed that? I guess I've showed that because there is a history in this country of the Conservative Party building council housing in vast numbers. And they do that because it's good business, right? Local authorities are responsible for housing people who can't house themselves, and the costs of paying a private sector landlords to house someone is much, much higher than if those houses are owned in the public sector. So you don't have to be a kind of raving socialist to see that building council houses is quite a good idea. And indeed, that's what they did in 1967. They didn't build amazing council houses, but they built a lot of them. Although I am very cynical about Theresa May, I think that there is an opportunity to build on that, because ultimately they are the government, and we have to persuade them to build more council houses. So you're totally right, whoever pointed out the kind of pathetically smallness of the actual numbers that are on the table. It is a kind of PR stunt rather than a meaningful attempt. But I feel like there's an opportunity for us to kind of remind the Tories of their once much more ambitious council house building programme, and to kind of recover some of that ambition, even within the current government.
Yeah. And I think the government is just desperate, and they don't know what they're doing. We're teetering on, we've got a debt crisis. Student debt is also humongous, and it's absolutely revolting. 6.1% interest rate. That's a ticking time bomb. All the other debt, they know they have to do something, and they're just throwing these things out, but they haven't got a clue what they're doing. Also because they don't know what's going to happen. Because once we leave the EU, the country's going to go on its arse. Even if, either we get a transitional period, but even the transitional period is still going to be really bad because businesses need to know what's going to happen. So I don't think, to be honest, I don't think the government has any policy. They're just trying, they've got as little policy as that they can stick letters on the wall behind them when they're doing a conference speech. So, yeah, I think that's the state we're in at the moment.
I think we had a question just over there.
Well, all it was, just coming back to something you said, there's just two things really. You said about what lessons should be learned from gentrification around Shoreditch when I worked there in the 90s, blah, blah, blah. I think one of the things that was really clear was that developers, even then, had such access to so much capital, and that local authorities and policy was so slow in being able to catch up with the spread there. And I live in Newham, and I'm brilliant work indeed, but I also am involved in putting together a neighbourhood plan on just a local level in Soho, and we have really big developers and estate owners around the table, and I sit as well in front of planning applications that come in for major developments in the area. And one of the things, I don't know if it's useful, but I think it's so important to actually look and see what you can do on the ground level as well in terms of helping to shape and put pressure on policymakers. And it is really hard to battle against developers with huge capital. But there are things that we are empowered to do, and I think your point about getting involved in local politics is really important.
I guess that taps into this, what we've all said is the need for us to get together, really, for localised, on-the-ground action, which you represented so well.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening in East London. There's some exciting stuff happening next week that I can't talk about right now, but it's very, very good. No, it's happening in Whitechapel. You'll see it soon enough, I'm sure. Yeah, I totally agree with what's been said about local action. Yeah, definitely vote in local elections, but get active, get on the streets, go to occupations. I agree with what you said. It does actually feel now like something's happening, because it's forced. It's always a situation where something comes out because it's forced. I don't want to, I don't know, today I was speaking to this woman on the street, and now what we're hearing more and more on the weekend when we speak to people who've got housing issues is that they're being told by the local council that we've got a responsibility to house your children, but not to house you. And that's actually, I don't want to be like shock, whatever, but that's actually that is what we're hearing now. Yeah, you can be on the street, but we're not going to put your children on the street. We're not going to do that, but you can be on the street and we'll take your children into care. We need to do something. We've all got the responsibility to do something. We need to take action. Anything you can do is useful. So yes, I would encourage everyone to try and do something, or read, or have statistics, which are very useful. Anything, yeah, take action.
Got any more questions? Yeah, we have 1, 2, 3. We'll just work our way down, I guess. So.
Yeah, speaking of gentrification, I think it definitely deserves being noticed, like the whole topic about Harlem in the US being gentrified. So personally, I'm from South Korea, so I don't know much about the whole dynamics and schemes of like gentrification crisis that is going on in London, but say, using kind of like Harlem, and again, Harlem as kind of like a model example, is there something maybe the local communities in London could learn outside, right?
Could learn.
Could learn good both from like, counter examples and examples.
Well, could you tell us more about this, the Harlem example, because I'm not really too familiar with it.
Because Harlem is basically like if you talk about gentrification in America, you basically are always probably going to mention Harlem in the sense that Harlem, which is kind of like the birthplace and foundation for the black culture in America, the Harlem Renaissance, like the hip hop, you name it, is currently being actually, the housing, they had all these kind of like tax abatements for housings and like structures, which led to an influx of population from other areas of New York and other parts of the US, including like say artists, of course, sorry. And
I'm not an artist, don't worry. One day maybe.
Yeah. Artists and even yoga studios and kind of fancy hotels and such, and also this image of Harlem being this like a cold, hot part of culture really became a catalyst for this kind of like, I don't know, like process of gentrification, and nowadays basically they are still fighting for like a preservation of local population, but in general I'm pretty sure that they've at this point almost lost the battle and just spread all across the other districts of New York. Yeah.
So I guess the question is,
so comparing that with like say like the question like London, is there any dynamics that kind of like maybe in dealing with like what's just happening in London, is there anything that could be maybe taken from that? I was just wondering.
I don't know much about Harlem, but I think the most obvious thing we should do is steal ideas from other countries where they work. So America, New York has rent control. It's not a great form of rent control. You can't raise your rent until the person leaves. So as soon as they leave or die, it shoots up colossally. So it's a kind of short-term buffer, but it's not a big fix. In Germany, they have other forms of rent control where it's like the rent can go up, but it goes up. It has to go up in a small amount, and a landlord can't evict a tenant unless they themselves want to move into that property. And tenants can do things like redecorate or put in a new kitchen. So that's why Germany has the lowest rate of home ownership in Europe, because it's kind of great to rent, right? So I feel like we should be pilfering ideas from other places. Here, less than 10% of our housing is built by kind of small developers or individual groups. In other countries, it's as high as 80%, like in the Netherlands or Belgium. So, as well as get involved in local politics, I'd sort of say, become property developers. There's enormous slack in that market. 30% profit is enshrined in the kind of feasibility studies that you do as a property developer. Like, what business could you possibly set up where you can guarantee a 30% return on investment? It's an extraordinary thing. So there's a huge opportunity for kind of a wave of more ethical property developers in the kind of model of like early 20th century paternalistic Quaker property developers to like make an impact on the UK. So I don't know if that appeals to any of you, but like becoming an ethical property developer might be a really good way to make an impact with your life.
And, you mind if I ask another quick follow-up question? This will be really quick, I promise.
Absolutely, yeah.
Then kind of leading on to that from like the housing problems, has there and will there be any plans in the UK to develop like maybe a satellite city next to Greater London area to resolve this whole housing crisis? Because yeah. I was just asking because in South Korea, like I come from Seoul in South Korea, where like 50% of our country's population live. And that's how we've been trying to deal with it. But thank you.
We have an answer there, I think.
I have a quick answer to that. That's not actually a solution. So there are satellite cities and community cities that are working. Croydon was also in the 80s that planned to do that kind of thing. And if you look at like international precedent, like Cairo, which has 6 or 7 satellite cities and is still the most populated city in Africa, it doesn't work. Satellite cities it's like making more roads. You just get more traffic. It doesn't work. So when we need to, like Finn was saying, you need to work within the space you have. Making more Potemkin villages it's not going to solve the problem. You're creating other space for more problems. So.
Any more questions? We have just one here and one there as well. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think like that contribution from the back was like quite timely, because like the question I was going to ask was sort of drawing things that the guy on the right and the guy on the left have said together, which is like you mentioned sort of like the population concentrations of London compared to the rest of the UK, compared it to other cities around the world. You mentioned this sad story of the fact that like there was a woman who was basically confronted with a choice of either being homeless or having to move to like Manchester or Birmingham, and everyone laughed as if that's like some sort of like horrible like choice. Like, have we got anything to say about? I think maybe is there a burden of proof on the panel to justify why this is like a conversation restricted to London and not trying to just broaden out the demand for housing across the UK?
I've got something to say on that, yeah, like definitely there's nothing wrong with Birmingham, there's nothing wrong with Manchester, there's nothing wrong with Glasgow, it's quite good actually, it's quite good. Yeah, exactly, I think the key thing for me anyway is that actually what we find is that it's not a choice. The thing is these people have certainly not been given a choice. And for the people that we're campaigning with anyway, the case is that their children go to school here locally, they've got jobs here locally, and their support networks are here. And certainly how our campaign started, one of the key things we were saying was that these young, vulnerable women who were, 17, had young children, 18, their support networks were here, and if they were sent to Manchester, Birmingham, what would they do? What would they do if their child got sick, etc., etc.? So for us in our campaigning, the key thing is that actually people are being given a choice, and we campaign with people that haven't been given that choice, as opposed to just certainly wanting to move out of London. We also meet a lot of people actually that have got council places or housing association, and they're desperately trying to get other council places outside of London because they want to move out, and they find that really tricky. And the reason I bring that up is because what you were saying about this chaos, if you start to look at like the local level of how to get a council flat or people in council, it is utter chaos, like you would believe. It is mental. So I think that's really key actually what you're saying, and the key word in it is choice. If someone has a choice, that actually they haven't been given a choice.
I think we have one question just
there.
there.
I had a question or an idea. I mean, also in regards to the artists, or how the change between how it was when you moved into the Shoreditch and how it is for the artists or young people in general today living in London. Because did you actually have a sense of community? Because I'm a young artist living in London, and I don't really feel like there is one area that I can go to that I would feel safe. I think that all my classmates at art college now, we are all trying to find a way how you can actually kind of survive, still have resources, but have energy to make something. Because this is another thing which I feel very strongly about, that
recently, when I moved here 7 years ago, I thought I'm going to grow old in this country, in this city, talking about different cities in the city for me. Now I'm not so sure anymore, because I just feel that what is happening is just, the atmosphere is getting so dense and so miserable, and you know me, I'm definitely not one to for giving up, but I feel like, is this really worth it? So I'm wondering what you guys have to say about that and about the mentality of people, of this atmosphere that is sinking into us under the skin, which is not often talked about because you probably can't put a graph there and you can't really put numbers on it. But I feel what you were talking, that you can feel it, you can feel something happening, but also probably on this, like something is bubbling up and there will be a chaos and probably the country will go down on its ass. But also on the bad, on the bad side, that it is eating. I feel like I feel anxious just walking down the street, not because I'm afraid someone's going to, like, you know, that someone will do something physical to me. I just don't feel that the atmosphere is welcoming.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's something that most of us feel as well. Is that something that, to some extent, a community which is a change since when you first came to London, in Shoreditch, in East London?
Yeah, I mean, things always change, things are always in flux, but the community, you know, you also grow new communities. And I understand the pressure, I understand the anxieties, I understand the difficulties of making things. I mean, it's, you know, we all experience it, we're all under this incredible strain, but I really want to have a positive attitude towards it. And it's great people are coming together, this place is being opened up. So there are openings, they might be very small, they are niched, but we have to occupy these niches and then spread out. I think we have to be strong. It's okay, it's going to be okay. That's just how it is, you know, we have to do it.
Any more questions? Just one at the back there.
Yeah. So you know, you showed that graph of kind of the population of London compared to the rest of the UK, and then you compare that to New York. If you looked at how much wealth London generates, and you compare to the rest of the UK, and you looked at how much wealth New York generates compared to the rest of the US, do you think the graphs would be the same sort of size? And do you think that's perhaps the question we should be asking is why are people moving to London? What are the kind of key financial drivers?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't made that wealth GDP kind of graph, but it would be interesting to compare. I'm sort of split on this thing about whether we should be discouraging people from coming to London in the first place. I don't think it's a problem that we necessarily have such a capital-heavy nation. I think it's a problem we have a capital-heavy nation and a low-density capital. Like, those two things seem untenable together. I can imagine a future where London is much higher density, we have much more strategic planning controls on, say, rent, and the public sector is building houses in the same numbers that it was after the war. That could be the future. Or there could be a future where we like urbanize the suburbs, rejuvenate post-industrial towns in the north, and move the political capital, move the cultural capital. I guess America has maybe Australia is a better example. They have different capitals do different things. So you have the financial capital one place, you have a cultural capital somewhere else, the political capital somewhere else again. We put them all in the same city. So it's kind of inevitable. And I was very excited when they were going to refurbish the House of Commons. I thought, oh great, let's move Parliament to Birmingham for 20 years while they do it. Of course, they're not going to do that because it's, you know, the MPs like to live in London. They're just like everyone else. But so I kind of feel like we have a choice, but ultimately we can solve this while having a capital heavy nation, and that's what we should be trying to do in the short term. And there's an interesting longer term question about could we tease apart some of that weight, move the political capital or something like that. But I would like to do that graph.
Any more questions? Just one there.
Yeah, no, I think it is a question of demand because, like, there is this buzz around London, and everyone, you know, you have to. I don't know. There's not. You don't have to go to succeed, but it's like the place to go. Whereas, why aren't the other cities like that? Like you're saying, like the different capitals, because you can buy, like young people can buy houses elsewhere, and you can rent elsewhere. But no, I'm the same. Like I want to be in London, but it's like, yeah, why not elsewhere? Like why not?
So 2 years ago, London got to the same population that it was at before World War II. So London has always had a shitload of people living here, even when the country was much smaller. And I just raised that because, like, you talk about demand, but actually there's the same number of people living here as there were in 1939. But prices are insane now, and they weren't then. So
wasn't that like slum dwellings and like the standard of living was not...
Yeah, like I don't want to live in 1939, but the demand is not being driven by you and I. It is being driven by investment commodities. That's what's pushing the price up.
But like investment is like in order to meet our demands. Like if our demand.
No, it's not. It's like gold. It's like gold, right? Gold has no intrinsic value, right? But it has value because people say it is valuable, and so you can move money around.
And so
through
it is
gold.
us that increase housing prices because we are demanding houses.
No, it's well, no, it's the flow of wealth and capital that's making it. It's not that at all.
I don't think it's not like normal people looking for a place to sleep that is driving it up. It's people trying to leverage this value like a kind of piece of gold or like a very expensive piece of art. Like it has value because we say it has value, but its intrinsic value is very low.
I disagree. I think it's a really big assumption. I think that you could argue that actually houses in London are cheap compared to what they actually should be because of having financial capital here, having the average income here is higher than the rest of the country. So it's actually an assumption to say it's intrinsic. It's not intrinsic. So you've got to be careful.
I mean, I think for me anyway, what does it boil down to? I'll use the word capitalism again because we're talking about capital and flows of capital, etc. If people were able to have somewhere to live, to have schools for their children, to have work, etc., then we wouldn't be sitting here saying capital. For me anyway, I wouldn't be sitting here saying the flows of capital was a problem. But the reality in London right now is that for a lot of people, life ain't working. They're not able to get a school place for their child. They're on benefits because they can't get a job, and my God, they can't afford their rents at all. So I think it throws up these questions, and I think we have to come back to the fact that there's a lot of empty homes, and a lot of developers deliberately leave those homes empty because it doesn't matter if they've got someone paying them rent because they get high interest from it anyway. It's a bubble, and it seems like the chaos in the bubble is going to burst quite soon.
And exactly the same thing is happening with farmland as well. You know that you get people who work in finance who want to invest money and they just buy farmland. It just sits there and then they try and get subsidies. So the same problem is happening. It's not just in the city. We have a disconnect between the function of something, a house to live in, farmland to farm, and it's just being used as investment. And that it's the whole system that really needs to be shaken up because it's not working anymore.
So just quickly, how do you propose to change that system?
Sorry, can you repeat that again,
please? No one's really kind of talked about the people who are working within them, because there's a lot of people here who are like-minded individuals, and we all have such good ideas, and these ideas never make it into those massive Goliaths that the council. So have you ever thought about actually working at a council?
Yeah. Like, do you know the architecture collective Assemble? They had the idea that maybe they should give up on architecture and all join the same council at the same time, and just like do a hostile takeover of all the, like just take all the positions. And I thought that was like super smart because it was acknowledging the fact that local authorities are so kind of present in all this. I think there are some signs of councils being creative. Croydon has started a charity which the council is the trustee of, and the reason they've done that is the charity then owns the council housing, and doesn't have to comply with right to buy laws. So it's a way of protecting those council houses from being privatised. That's quite clever, and sort of speaks to Croydon being a kind of innovator within public housing. But then you also look at like the massive list of estates that are currently on the chopping block from Labour-controlled councils. So I'm like, I really want to believe in the public. I think that we have an extraordinary legacy in this country of public and civic duty. And it's a fairly recent phenomenon that it seems to have fallen apart, partly under pressure from cuts, partly from shady fuckers like Wales. But we could get back to a more invigorated public sector if we engaged with it. Yeah. I'm optimistic about the public sector, but they keep letting me down.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can I just like put an advert out to this room full of people who like are clearly like incredibly passionate about solving the housing crisis, and I think like there are people in government who do care, and not enough of them sometimes. And like, please all apply for like jobs in local government and central government, and like make a change from the inside. If you're doing something that you're not like enjoying at the moment.
Ed Lister, who used to be in charge, well, I think he's still chair of the Homes and Communities Agency, just the other week, and he was like, it's easy to solve the housing crisis. All you need to do to live here is to offer a bank a higher rate of return, offer an investor a higher rate of return than a bank. I was like, what? Like, you think that just asking people to compete with a bank is the way that we can solve? So like, that's an example of just like the extraordinary pig-headedness of some of the people who still have control, even if there are signs of change, you know, in isolated pockets. I feel like we've lost it.
Yeah, so we're going to end now, and just to end in kind of what we try and do in EYESORE is try and be as optimistic and positive as possible. Sometimes not that successfully, but I guess my final question to everyone is, are you optimistic?
Well, that slide, I'm optimistic about that slide. Does it just say optimism?
Our critics, and there are a good many of them, are going to be confounded. At the end of the last war, no houses at all were being built. Yet we have got, as I said, throughout the country as a whole, not only to replace the consequences of the destruction of war, not only to put up the houses that Hitler's bombs blew down, not only have we got to repair the houses that were damaged, not only have we to make up the arrears of 6 years of lack of housing maintenance, but in addition to that, in addition to what the enemy did to us, we have got to try and make up for the arrears of housing left by 50 years of Tory misrule in Britain.
So that's Zanira and Bevan, who invented, famously, the National Health Service, but also, less famously, invented council housing. That's in 1946, when, you know, the country's in ruins, is bankrupt, millions of people have died, huge problems, and that was the kind of political leadership that we saw then. I think there's stuff that we can do as individuals and communities. We could start ethical property development companies, but the thing that we need to do is to believe that change is possible in the political space and make it happen. And I think there is signs of that. I am excited by Jeremy Corbyn. I am excited by Croydon. But we all need to like go and knock on doors. Ultimately, that's what's going to change it. We need to change the people in power, and the only way to change the people in power is to become campaigners on behalf of those of better people, even if we're not the people ourselves.
I think we have to make better art.
Yeah, well, art's awful.
Better art.
Oh, that's all I got.
This does need to be better, that's true. We've got a space in Newham that people can use if they want to. We got our office space and we've called it Sylvia's Corner, and the reason we called it Sylvia's Corner is after Sylvia Pankhurst, who was running about in the East End 100 years ago, fighting the same battles that we are now. And between that time, as has been pointed out, we had very well-built council housing for a period of time, and we can do it again. So definitely optimism at all times, because we can do something if we get together, and that's the biggest cliche ever, but it is true. Do something, start on a local level, whatever you can do. And you know what, it makes you, whoever said that London feels a bit crappy, yeah, I know what you mean, but you know what, it makes you feel better. It's good for your mental health to go out and start to shout at councillor. It helps.
Right, well, on that note, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our speakers. Big round. So the main reason we're here is that we've just released issue 3 of EYESORE. We started about a year ago. This is our 3rd issue. We've got a copy anywhere? At the back. At the back. Okay, we'll just imagine it's here. And we're doing this talk now, and we're having a party which starts in about 45 to 55 minutes downstairs. Everyone's invited. Please make your way down. There'll be drinks, music,
and a good opportunity. Sorry to interrupt. Like everyone's kind of talk about what we've been talking about today, as well as like just sharing ideas and just actually trying to change something within us. Yeah, essentially just talk to each other and not just listen, I guess.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, please come and join us downstairs, and we can take it from there. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.